Alrighty. So my name's Christine. I was invited here by Jennifer to just tell you about my career. I'm very new as a science journalist, and I'll tell you about my path into science writing in the beginning of the talk, and then I'll go into other aspects of just talking about science writing in general. So how I got into science writing, I thought that I would go into academia. I thought I wanted to be a professor and teach chemistry at the college level, do research. So I went to grad school here at the U of I. I got frustrated with my research. I hit some bumps in the road. Then I realized that I really still liked the idea of my research. I liked talking about it, giving presentations, even writing papers about it, but I didn't like being in the lab and actually doing the work. So towards the end of my graduate program, I sought out opportunities to write about science, and then figured out that I really loved doing it. So basically the transition was from science in practice to science on paper. I have not left science. I'm just doing a different type of science work. So I guess it kind of boiled down to this question of do I enjoy knowing a lot about a few things, or would I rather know a little bit about lots of things? And this is from PhD Comics. I should have cited it here. Sorry, this is going on the web. But it's this graph of what you know versus how much you know about it. And when you go, in undergrad, you know a lot about a few things, and then as you go into graduate school, you start knowing less and less about lots of things, but you know a whole lot about like a few things. And that's good, because then PhD scientists are able to really dig deep into one problem and answer really interesting questions in science. But for me, I think that I began to realize I'm more of a generalist. I'd rather know lots about fewer things rather than focusing in on one specific thing. Now as you go into science writing, most people end up specializing in a certain area, because science obviously is a very broad field. So it's not entirely true, but the idea is that when you're a journalist and you're covering lots of different research going on by lots of different labs, you get to learn a lot about what's going on instead of having to just focus on one or a handful of things. So my path into science writing began, I'll just explain. In 2007, I began working on my PhD here with Ryan Bailey in the chemistry department. And then this is a simple graph showing how I was really excited about grad school at first, and then I told you I started hitting some bumps in the road, and by the end I was just really unhappy with what I was doing. So I started off. I took a journalism class in my fourth year. I had just heard about science writing. I didn't know much about it, so I contacted Jennifer Follis, who teaches the Journalism 200 Intro to Journalism class, and I took it. So I was in a class with lots of freshmen and sophomores, but I didn't mind, because I had a lot of fun with it. And I also showed up to the Daily Illini info session and began writing feature stories for them, mostly focused around science, for their business and technology section, which ran on Tuesdays. I also started blogging for Chemical and Engineering News, and I wasn't actually blogging about science. I was blogging about careers. So I found this great opportunity to kind of just get some writing experience, and also to explore different types of non-traditional careers for chemists. And so it gave me an excuse to reach out to lots of different people and talk to them and ask them questions about their careers. And I did it mostly for myself, because I wanted to learn about lots of different potential career paths. And after doing that for about a year or maybe a little more, I basically was like, I really enjoyed the writing side of I really just enjoy writing. So at the end of my fourth year of grad school in 2011, I applied to an internship at Fermilab, that's up in Batavia, Illinois. And I took a 3-month break from graduate school to write about physics and other things going on at Fermilab for their newsletter, Fermilab Today. Came back to grad school, and I was kind of I knew that going into this, taking a 3-month break from grad school could mean that I might not want to go back. But I decided I wanted to come back and finish since I was pretty close to the end. So in that last year, when I was finishing up my research in the lab, I also began freelance writing for CNE News. Since I was blogging for them, I had a connection there, and they took me on as a freelancer, even though I didn't have any experience writing the types of stories that go on their website. That's chemical and engineering news. And then I also got, through that, got some opportunities with the American Chemical Society, including writing these like little news briefs for the Journal of the American Chemical Society. So a lot of my early journalism experience, or science writing experience, was focused on like these chemistry, either journals or trade publications. And that's one thing I'll just kind of mention. That's a good place to start if you have a science background, is looking at the journals and the magazines that are kind of targeted towards the people who have your background. So if there's a similar society for biologists or whatever, that could be a good place to start to look for opportunities, because that's also where your knowledge base is. I also looked for contests. I found this writing contest in Nature Chemistry, and I wrote this essay about how helium is such a cool element. And then this is not science writing, but it is a form of science communication. I entered the Dance Your PhD contest, and I did a dance about my research, which you can find on YouTube. I did not win, but it was a lot of fun. And I put it here because it's just an example of it was something fun that I did to communicate science with a different medium. And it actually, I did use it as when I applied to an internship, which I didn't end up getting, but I used it as a multimedia clip because I did do some video editing for this as well, and I used it as a sample, not a writing sample, but a multimedia sample for that internship. And the editor of this particular magazine said that I did a pretty good job with it, and that's why he gave me a phone interview, but I didn't end up getting that internship. As a scientist, you may attend conferences, and if you're interested in science writing, you can try to find opportunities at conferences to network and to meet science writers, because science writers go to these big conferences to cover them as journalists or as writers. And so that's one thing I did in my last year. I went to PitCon, it's a big analytical chemistry conference, and before the conference, I contacted a bunch of science writers who I thought might be there. And also while I was there, I wandered around, in those big exhibits where they have like different companies and stuff come. There were also booths for journals, and I went and I talked to journal editors, because I think at the time I was still toying with the idea of, editing, maybe journalism, maybe writing, maybe editing. So I talked to journal editors as well. And, just finding ways to connect with people and talk to them, I think that's kind of what I found really helped me figure out that this is what I want to do, is by talking to lots of people who were doing something that seemed interesting to me, to find out what is their job like, what is their day like, and how did they get into it. So these are two examples. At this particular conference, I met an editor of this magazine, and then I started freelancing for them, and I wrote several stories. And then I also, just through chit-chatting with random people, I met someone who was a consultant for this company, and I got a technical writing assignment for them. So it's not journalism. I was like writing a manual for one of their instruments, but that was another thing that I was considering. Do I want to do technical writing? Well, let me try it. If there's an opportunity, let me try it out and see if I like it. I didn't really like the technical writing stuff, but I only gave it one little shot. But so at the end of mid 2012, I defended and graduated. And then that following fall, I started journalism school. So I decided to go to journalism school here at the U of I, partly because my husband had a job here, so we were staying in Champaign, and so I applied to the program here. I didn't apply anywhere else. And then they offered a fellowship to attend school, so I was like, if you're going to pay me to go to journalism school, I will go. So I did. So I started in the fall. That fall, at the end of the semester, I had my husband and I had our first baby. So from 2012 to 2014, I kind of stretched out a one-year program over 2 years, and I worked on my master's, and I just finished that up last May. So that's why I said I'm still very new as a science journalist. I put pictures of my family here because I think it's important as you're making career decisions. You're not just deciding what kind of career, what kind of job you want to do, but I don't know, for me, it has been helpful to think about what kind of life do I want to have. So science writing has also appealed to me on a more personal level too, because there's some flexibility, which I'll talk about more in a couple slides. But so in journalism school is when I got my first experience doing radio stories. And it was kind of a fluke. I went in thinking I was going to focus on print and online news writing and feature stories and that sort of thing. But in my last semester, we were working on our master's projects, and the professor who was assigned to oversee the master's projects, her focus is radio journalism. And she was like, well, have you thought about doing a radio story about the topic I had picked? And I was like, no, but I'd love to try it. So I did that. And basically, this is like the final product of my master's project. I put together this website, and there was a 3-part series on this topic of home birth, which isn't totally science-y, but it's got a little bit of a health aspect to it. It was just something I was personally interested in at the time. So I got this experience. Journalism school was great because I got training both in reporting and writing. You get great feedback from professors who have lots of knowledge and experience in journalism. Many of the professors here and in other journalism programs, they worked for many years as a journalist before they became professors, so they know a lot about. They have the practical experience, and they can serve as like editors, and so it's a safe place to kind of learn and produce journalism and then make mistakes, before you're out in the real world. And then also I mentioned, just learning other skills in addition to writing. That's becoming more important these days, and that's what I hear all the time from practicing journalists who I talk to. Having any additional skills in multimedia or graphics or photography or web design or other things like that are really important to being competitive these days. So I took a few classes and dabbled in a few different things. And then you get to build your portfolio. I didn't publish actually any stories from my classes, although I tried. Didn't get them published like in a newspaper or magazine or anything like that. But these radio stories, I published them on my own on this website, and then they also went on to a website called CU Citizen Access. So I actually did have some published radio, broadcast radio stories that I could use as writing samples. So then when I want to look for other writing opportunities, I can show that I have produced this work. And then, for me, I'm really glad I went to journalism school, because I would have never thought about doing radio stories, but I found that I really liked doing that. I really liked doing stories, audio stories. And so right after I graduated, I did a broadcast journalism internship up in Chicago with a program called Radio Health Journal, and that was just it was a pretty short time, but I did produce like 6 or 7 radio stories that were broadcast on a national level, which was really exciting for me because I was just so brand new to doing radio stories. And then in July, I took my first job. I was a science writer with the American Oil Chemist Society. They're actually based in Urbana, Illinois, and it was a really good fit with my background in chemistry and then my training in journalism. I decided to leave after 6 months. I wrote for their magazine. I wrote the news sections for biotechnology and health and nutrition. But I decided I just had another baby in January, and so I decided I wanted to go back to freelancing. So my baby girl is almost 3 months old now, and I decided to go back to freelancing. And actually, just this past week, my first radio story as a freelancer aired on WILL, which is a local public radio station, and it was about research that was done in a chemistry lab here. And it's actually in a lab that was just 2 floors up from where my lab was. So I knew about this work going on, and then right around just the past few months, this drug that they were working on just entered clinical trials, and I thought, well, this would be a neat radio story. And so I pitched it to the local radio station, and they were interested because they were putting together a whole series of cancer stories that aired last week. And so I got the opportunity to do this. I wasn't planning on freelancing or getting back to work so quickly after having after having my daughter, but the timing worked out okay. So this is kind of where I'm at right now. I'm at the very, very beginning of my career. Well, not very beginning, because I've been freelancing part-time when since I've been in school for like the past, since 2011, so several years. But this is the first time that I'm no longer a student, and I'm now just kind of working on my own as a freelancer. And yeah, I mean, you can ask me more questions about my plans, but I think the rest of the time I'd like to just focus on talking about science writing in general. So before I do that, though, I wanted to just say there are other ways to combine science and communication. If you are interested in being a science communicator or a science writer, there are many scientists out there who engage with the public through other ways. It's not their primary thing, but it's something that they do in addition to their research or their main job. There are professors and other research scientists who are active bloggers, so they blog about their work, and they blog about other work that's being done in their field. There are other ways you can do science outreach, and advocacy. I mean, even just by going into classrooms and talking about your research and doing, stuff like that. And then other science communication careers, which I won't talk about today, but if you're interested in, I can connect you with other resources and also people who work in those areas. There's also technical writing I mentioned. A lot of companies will hire writers to write their instruction manuals or other materials that go online. So that requires a more technical or scientific background, but also the writing skills. There are grant writers, any research lab. Some will hire writers to work with them to compose grant applications to get funding for their research ideas. I mentioned there's also journal editing. So that's like kind of handling the peer review process, but also having an eye for what makes a good, that requires a background in science. And then there's also public information officers who represent universities and institutions and other organizations, and they kind of mediate between the scientists and the journalists, and their role is more, they write press releases and other things about new research that's coming through the pipeline, and they try to attract media attention for their institution. But it requires a lot of the same skills of a journalist. Like I said, I won't be talking in depth about those areas today, but if you want to know more, let me know, or these are other areas that you could do a Google search online to find out more information about if you're curious. So what do science writers do? Science writers, pretty straightforward, but they communicate how science works and why it matters. And there are different audiences that you might write for if you become a science writer. There's the general public. There are also magazines that are geared towards scientists. So like I mentioned, C&E News is the magazine of the American Chemical Society. Most scientific societies have a magazine that goes along with it that goes out to their members, and that also might be available online. But the audience is a more highly educated scientific, background type of audience. And then, there are audiences that are more mixed, maybe like something like popular science, where you might have a scientists who are interested in reading, but it's also kind of geared towards the more, like the general public who is curious about science. So, and then various outlets, newspapers, magazines, radio, TV, there's the whole web, and, blogs and podcasts. And then I mentioned science writers also work for universities, federal labs, other industries and organizations, and that's more the public relations side of it, but it's still science writing. But the mission of all, for all of these audiences and all of these outlets is to be able to explain like complicated scientific things with two goals, maximum simplicity. You don't want to be over people's heads, and you don't want to be so technical that people can't follow or understand what you're talking about, but you don't want to compromise to the point where you forfeit the accuracy. So that's always the balance that you're trying to juggle as a science writer, is how can I explain this clearly and thoroughly, and yet but still be true to the science. And that's something that I feel like any science writer will work to develop throughout their entire career. So the things that I love about being a science writer, you're paid to learn about science. Like you're a lifelong student. I've always liked being a student. I've always just liked learning about science, and now that's my job. There's flexibility. If you're a freelancer, there's flexibility because you're your own boss, so you work as much or as little as you want to work. There are pros and cons to that flexibility. And then there's also freedom to pursue the different areas of science that you're interested in. So even though my background's in chemistry, I find that I really like learning about health research, so health and medicine. So I'm kind of looking at those areas as maybe being my focus going forward. Things that you might dislike about the career. You could make more money if you worked in a research lab as a practicing scientist, most likely. Maybe if you become really, really famous, you can make a lot of money as a science writer. But then also, if you're a freelancer, you work alone. Most freelancers say that an important skill to have is the ability to just, or being okay with just being with your computer all day in an office by yourself, because that's yes, you're interviewing scientists, but a lot of your work, you're reading, you're trying to come up with story ideas, you're communicating via email and sometimes via phone with editors with your ideas, but then you spend the bulk of your time sitting and trying to craft a story, so you're working alone. How much can you actually make freelancing? I was told that you guys are curious about the finances, which makes sense because it's an important factor. It really depends, but I'll just kind of throw out, don't quote me on any of this. This is just kind of my sense of what being in this area, what I've found to be the case. If you write for a trade publication, which is like a scientific magazine, the going rate is like $1 a word. It's been $1 a word for a long time, I've heard, like maybe even more than 10 years, so it has not gone up with with inflation or anything like that. It sounds like a lot. If you write a 500-word story, you get $500, but you might have spent 10, 20 hours, who knows, it varies depending on how much you already knew about the topic, how much background research did you have to do, how long did it take for you to track down your sources. So the hourly rate, it's really kind of hard to say what you can make. And as a freelancer, the more you produce, the more you make, so it really is kind of up depending on that. Public relations stories typically pay more than journalism stories. There are also typically more jobs available for public relations pieces than for pure journalism pieces. In general, stories that are written for more general audiences pay less and are more competitive. There's more people trying to get those jobs. Now if you write for a really big name publication, then maybe that's not the case, but audio stories, I've recently learned about $100 a minute is a going rate for radio stories and podcasts and that sort of thing. It sounds like a lot, but again, I'm saying it can take many hours to produce a 5-minute story. So the hourly rate maybe isn't that great, but it depends on how well you work or how quickly you're able to produce these stories. And then blog posts really don't pay much unless you're really good. So like the New York Times blogs, I believe their writers get paid with more like journalism standards. But if you blog, when I was blogging for CNE News, or if you blog for most other publications, they don't really pay bloggers. But one important caveat is that yes, you're producing stories, but then you also spend a lot of time, maybe even up to half of your time, reading. Anyone in journalism will say that the best journalists an important skill is to be well read, because you learn and you acquire knowledge and knowledge about your craft from reading other examples of good work. And then as a freelancer, you pitch story ideas, which means I think this is a cool idea. Let me see if, Science magazine would like to hire me to write a story about it. So you might spend lots of time putting together a pitch, but if the editor's not interested, then that's time wasted with no money. So, and then managing your business, there's the whole financial side of it, keeping track of invoices, making sure you're getting paid, and, So there's a lot more that goes into it because it is like your own business when you're a freelancer. I'll talk a little bit about having a science writing staff job in a couple slides. But basic skills that it takes to succeed as a science writer, curiosity is important because, like I said, you're a lifelong student, and if that doesn't interest you, then then you're not going to have fun with this job. Critical thinking is also really important because there's a lot of stuff that goes out there which may or may not be very, I don't know, credible or well researched, or, you know, just having the ability to look at a research study and know what are the strengths and the weaknesses, you know, in how the study was designed, and being able to ask questions, because if you talk to the scientist who did that study, of course they're going to tell you this is the most, well, not always, but, you know, they're going to highlight the positive parts of their research, and they're not going to necessarily bring up the shortcomings or the limitations or the failures unless you specifically ask for those things. But also, you know, being skeptical and knowing how to ask questions that kind of get to the bottom of an issue. Being able to explain complex things simply, I've already mentioned. Reporting and writing skills, which means, you know, you're able to talk to scientists and ask them questions about their work, and then get the information you need and then synthesize it all. Bonus skills, like I've already mentioned, are these like multimedia skills, especially nowadays with just the way that the media is changing. And then meeting deadlines and time management is huge because deadlines are really important for publications. And so if you don't work ahead of time and then you don't get the crucial interview you need to write the story, then you don't have a story to turn in, and then you've kind of ruined a relationship with an editor, and that may mean that they never hire you to do another story. So meeting deadlines is really important. So I've heard. I have not been in the place of breaking a relationship with an editor over a missed deadline yet, and hopefully I won't. Traits, being able to handle rejection, because sometimes you come up with what you thought was a great story idea, but the editor's not interested, and you need to be okay with that. That's just how it goes. And then when you do turn in a story, it's going to be edited. That's part of the process, and it takes having a thick skin to, you know, you really liked how you wrote that sentence and your editor wants to completely scratch it and rewrite it, you know. You have to be okay with that and be willing to accept those critiques. And financial uncertainty, because like I mentioned, as a freelancer at least, your monthly income will fluctuate depending on how well you did, you know, pitching stories, and then also just discipline, because it is your own business, flexibility, persistence. You know, you might have a great story idea that didn't work for one magazine, but it might be the perfect fit for another one, and so kind of, you know, being willing to kind of just keep knocking on doors if you have an idea that you want to pursue. Science writing, I just would also just mention it's a huge responsibility. You know, I found this cartoon just through a Google image search, but, you know, you always hear you should present both sides of an issue fairly, but it's not always that black and white, because some issues, you know, so this is like the flat earth debate. Some scientists say the earth is round, but a guy I know says there's just a bunch of, you know, so it's like there are certain things that you want to make sure you present all, you know, many sides, but then other things where it's like, well, the scientific consensus is this. So if you give voice to someone who's opposed to that, it can give the perception to a reader that those things are equal when really it's not. And you can try to explain that. It's not always so simple or so cut and dry to be able to present an issue with good balance. And that's something that I think is a skill that you learn, that I'm certainly still learning, and that you'll learn throughout your entire career, is how to accurately and fairly present an issue, and all, you know, the very many different sides of an issue. And then I just think that this is a funny comic from PhD Comics, which shows kind of what the science news cycle is. So typically, science news starts up here with this guy at the laptop, and, you know, he's typing up a research paper on some of his findings. He finds a correlation between A and B, and then the university public relations office, the people who write the press releases to try to attract media attention, it's like, look, scientists find a potential link between A and B, and then that gets picked up by news organizations. A causes B. It's like, well, not exactly, but oftentimes you'll see headlines that kind of suggest that it's a bigger deal than it actually is, but then that gets picked up on the web, and you've got blogs, and anyone can put anything on the web, and then you've got, scientists out to kill us again, and then picked up by cable news and local news, and all of a sudden you've got your grandma wearing a hat saying, I'm wearing this to ward off A. So this is like science news gone bad. but I put this here just because science journalists and science writers have a huge responsibility to not contribute to the confusion about science that is already out there. And it can be tricky because, especially with online, back in the day with newspapers, it's like you have to sell papers, so you have to have those flashy headlines. Nowadays, it's more like clickbait. It's like you need people to click on your story, because the more clicks that your story gets, the more advertising money comes into the news organization. And that's a dilemma that news organizations face. They need people to come to their site, so having a catchy headline will do that. But it can also contribute to misconceptions and misunderstandings in the public. So it's a big responsibility to make sure that you're not contributing to misperceptions or misinformation. Another question that often comes up about journalism, especially when I said I'm going into journalism instead of going into a more traditional science career, it's like, well, isn't journalism dying? Different people will have different things to say about that, but I'd like to say that it's changing. It's not going away, but the way people get their news is certainly changing. So this is a graph, some data from the Pew Research Center about how people get their news. So this is the percent change in the audience. This is from several years ago, but basically the shift, more people are looking online and fewer people are looking to TV, magazines, radio, newspapers, TV. And so it's not that journalism is going away, but it certainly is changing. And that's why I mentioned, having an idea, having some skills that go along that can make you competitive in this sort of changing field, I've been told are important. I'll just mention a little bit more about journalism versus public relations. Science writers work in both areas. One thing which I've already mentioned is that there are more jobs in public relations. So this is from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, but there's a 3-to-1 ratio of PR jobs versus journalism jobs. So for science writers who, well, basically, I'll just put that out there. That's just the reality. There are more jobs in public relations. In journalism, there are a few basic differences. The goal of journalism is to have balance in your reporting and to allow the reader to have the information they need to decide their position on whatever issue it is that you're covering. There's more competition because there's more people and fewer jobs, and in general, there's less money for a journalism job versus a public relations job. And sometimes for journalism, especially if you work for a place where you have to stay on top of the news 24/7, especially with the internet, and a lot of magazines and other websites are publishing stories around the clock. A lot of people will say, who work in that type of environment, will say there are crazy hours when you're a journalist if you're in that type of environment, because you have to always be aware of what's going on, because now with the internet, it's always about being the first to get something up on the web, which can create problems, because sometimes in the rush to get things online, errors, that can create errors, but that's another topic. Public relations, the goal is, what I've been told, is to give the reader fuzzy feelings about the company or the organization or wherever it is that you work for. So you write stories, but there's always a spin, there's always a positive spin on everything, and you don't necessarily, I would say good public relations would highlight the flaws of a study, but typically you want to emphasize the positive things, and there are more jobs and typically more money. But in both, you're learning about science, you're interviewing experts, and you're writing stories. So it's the same and similar skill sets, but two different goals. And then, I've talked a lot about freelancing, but there are staff jobs for science writers, but there are a limited number of positions. There are only maybe a handful of newspapers in the entire country that have science sections anymore, New York Times being, probably the most well-known. 10, maybe 20 years ago, there were science sections in lots of newspapers, but all of those jobs have been cut as newspapers have shrunk. And other media outlets have suffered as well in terms of science and other specialized forms of journalism. But if you work for a staff job, if you do get a job working for a single outlet, then you write for that one publication, you have a steady paycheck, hopefully you have benefits, and hopefully you have some fixed hours, but sometimes, because even if you have a staff job, if you're on the 24-hour news cycle, then you're still kind of engaged around the clock. But if you're a freelancer, you can live anywhere, you can work from home, so there's no commute. You can write for any publication that was willing to hire you to write for them, but pay fluctuates. There's no benefits. You have to pay for your own health insurance and that sort of thing, unless you have a spouse that has health insurance and you can get covered through them. Details, but important. But in both, you're pitching story ideas, you're interviewing scientists, you're meeting deadlines, so those are the similarities. One thing I'll point out about freelancing is that a freelancer in New York City gets paid the same amount as a freelancer in Champaign, so where you live geographically matters because the money goes farther in certain places than others. So that's one way that freelancing can be a more viable option in the middle of central Illinois. But maybe not so much in a bigger city. It's just another factor to consider. I think a lot of times staff jobs will consider the cost of living, but when you're a freelancer, it's the same rate regardless of where you live. And then I just thought this was an interesting quote. Don't romanticize freelance writing. Like acting, if you meet Brad Pitt, it seems like a really cool gig, but the actor you really want to talk to is the guy who just delivered your pizza. So I really like freelancing. It works out for me. But if, like I said, my husband has a stable job, and so my income fluctuating isn't as big of a deal as if I were a single person trying to support myself or trying to support my entire family. I don't know if I would choose freelancing in that case. It would probably depend on, lots of factors, but those are all considerations to take into account when, if freelancing is something you're thinking about. But how to be competitive in this field, having published work is important because anytime you pitch to an editor, you need to show them examples of your published work, and writing for a class assignment doesn't count. Sometimes, some of them will take blog posts, but not always. And then, obviously just having writing skills. And networking is really huge in science writing because like having a reputation and having a relationship with an editor is huge because they're more likely to accept, to assign stories to writers who they know and who they've worked with before and who have worked well for them before than for just someone who they've never met or who they have no idea about. What doesn't matter in science writing is research publications. When I was putting together my resume for the Fermilab internship, I realized like all of the stuff that I thought was so important, like building my resume as a scientist, like it didn't matter anymore because they didn't care that I published research, had published research or whatever else. Academic writing in science journalism does not matter. If you've written a paper for a scientific journal, if I were to send that to a journalism editor, they would look at me like I was crazy, like, why are you sending this to me? And then I put this here too because you don't need to have a journalism degree to do journalism. I had some freelance writing experience before I started journalism school, so one thing I considered doing was just freelancing and just trying to build my career just with my science background. And lots of science writers do that. But some of them go to journalism school and some of them go to science writing programs, and there are a handful in the country that have specialized science writing certificates. But some of the pros I've already mentioned: you work with journalism professors, you learn new skills, you can make your mistakes, and some of the cons include you're delaying your career start. It's not required, and then in many cases there's a big cost that's associated with a graduate degree in journalism, or so those are all factors to consider. But if I could do it all over again, I would do it the way I've done it. Even the PhD, which was really tough at times, now looking back in retrospect, those were character building times, the times when I was beating my head against the wall, but I learned perseverance and other things like that. And then I learned a lot, during the years being in graduate school, how to think, how to critique, how to communicate, come up with ideas. And although you do not need a PhD by any means to do science writing, for me, so far, it has only helped me when I've interviewed for the few jobs that I've had recently, and in particular with the public radio story, the editor there was really interested in working with me because I had both a journalism background and some, and an advanced degree in science. Like, for him, that was a positive thing. I've heard from other people that editors look down on PhD scientists because they just assume that if you have a PhD that you don't know how to talk about science for the general public. So I've heard both sides, but for me, it's been good to have one, but I don't necessarily recommend it if you're not thinking about going for a PhD and you want to be a science writer. I would probably say just don't get a PhD because you want to be a science writer. That's what I'll say. But if you're already in the program, like I was in my case when I realized I wanted to do this, then I just decided to stick it out, and it hasn't been hurtful in any way. It's been helpful for me. And then there is no one way to get into science writing. Every science writer out there has a different story. There are some similarities. A lot of them had science backgrounds and realized that they didn't want to practice science like me. Others were in journalism and realized they just loved covering sciences. So there are people coming in from both paths. But general career advice that I like to give is just to jump in and try stuff, because that's the only way you'll find out what you like. So when I took that journalism class, in 2010 or whenever it was, I didn't know that I wanted to be a journalist, but I was like, I need to at least try it and see. And it turns out I really liked it. There were many things I tried that I found out I didn't like. I also did some editing stuff, which I didn't mention, but I realized I like writing and producing my own work rather than editing. I'd say talk to people who are doing jobs that pique your interest. And then also just finding mentors, joining professional societies. For science writing, there's a big National Association for Science Writers, which is a really great way to connect with other science writers and to find mentors. And then I would just say knock on doors, because typically what I've found in my experience is one door leads to another. I didn't show all the connections between how one opportunity led to another for me, but that's often the case. Like, you find out about one thing, and then I started blogging for C&E News, and then they hired me as a freelancer. That's one big example, but there are others. And then start early if possible. Like, if you're working as a scientist, or if you're in school still, you don't want to wait until your last semester. Not to defray anyone who's in their last semester from pursuing science writing, but what the advice I was given when I was in graduate school, and I was like, should I just quit grad school and just become a science writer? And many science writers told me, stay in grad school, but use your spare time, if whatever little of it you have, to try to build up your skills as a communicator, as a writer, as a journalist. And that's what I did, and I found that helps ease your transition, because then you can start building your skills, building your portfolio, and then when you're ready to make the switch, you can make the switch and be more confident, going in that new direction. So yeah, I just want to put a plug in for next Friday. Oh, the date's not even on here. It's a week from this Friday, which is the 17th, April 17th at Beckman at 1:00 p.m. There's a free public panel on non-traditional, traditional and alternative science careers, and I'll be representing science journalism there, but there's three other people who will be there, including someone on the politics side, policy side, and then also, research information analytics. Anyways, it's at the Beckman Institute Auditorium. That's a week from this Friday if you're curious about learning about any of these other science careers. And then I really like talking about science writing, so if you have any questions, we can chat right now, or if you think of something tomorrow, you can just jot down my email address, and I'm happy to talk with you some more. And if you're really curious about science writing, these are the 3 books that I highly recommend getting your hands on. So I think there's a little bit of time for questions. I talked a lot, I'm sorry. But please, let me know if you have any questions.
Any questions? Sure.
Oh, yeah.
What did you do when you were transitioning, like during grad school? Like, how did you find spare time with your
Yeah, so when I was in the journalism class, well, basically in grad school, when you're doing research, you can do your work at any time, for the most part. Sometimes. It depends on your advisor. Depends on lots of things. But basically, I found ways to to do interviews and write stories for the Daily Illini while I was in grad school. I just juggled it with my schedule, and my advisor was aware of what I was doing, and he just said, as long as you're not slipping in your research, that's fine if you pursue those things. So I just found a way to squeeze it in. I did a lot of writing at night. And then in journalism school, I didn't do that much freelancing. When I focused more on my classes when I was in journalism school, but I was writing stories for that and stuff and getting that experience. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
would you not been able to be a freelance writer, like if you weren't married?
I mentioned that I said it helps to have a spouse with a stable income, but there are certainly freelance writers out there who are, either supporting themselves or supporting a family. What the advice that I was given, which is why I took the job at the American Oil Chemist Society last year, the advice I was given was, if you can get a staff job, get it, because there's more stability, you can build your portfolio, you can develop your skills, you can establish your reputation, you can even specialize, in what you're writing about, so that you can kind of market yourself as the expert on this topic if you end up going freelance later. A lot of people will say don't try to freelance straight out of school with no journalism experience, because it's really hard. It's really hard to break in. If you don't have a relationship with an editor and you pitch a story to them, story idea, it might be a great story idea, but they might not be willing to risk it with someone who they don't know or who doesn't have an established reputation as a writer already. So that's a complex question. There are many freelance science writers who support themselves, but they'll say it's tough because of the financial uncertainties. But it's something to consider if you're trying to make a career of it. Yeah.
Would you find a journalism school if you weren't paid?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think at the time I was thinking I wouldn't go if I had to pay. It was valuable, though. It's really hard to answer that question. There are varying opinions out there if you ask different science writers. I'm glad I went. I still don't know if I would go if I knew I had to pay for it. But given that I got these experiences and I discovered, so for me, that's kind of a more personal answer, because I would have never figured out that I really like doing radio stories if I didn't go to journalism school. So for me, that kind of makes it worth it, because this is like a new thing that I realized I love that I didn't know before. But in terms of skills, you can learn all the skills of a journalist by getting a job as a journalist and working with editors, because that's the real life experience, and that's where you can learn lots of things on your own. You can learn about web stuff, multimedia stuff. I liked having the structured classroom environment where I could kind of learn and have this carved out time to be like, this is my time to practice and experiment and try things, take risks and fail. That's a really tough question, though. I think it would depend on how much was it costing, and how confident would I be that I could pay that back, and how soon. Certainly something to consider. Yeah.
Anyone else have questions? Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Christine.
Sure. Yeah.